Hello, everybody. Today we're going to cover chapter 1 about communication. So give me just a second. I'm going to switch my screen over to my PowerPoint slides. Okay, so there are 5 fundamental reasons why we communicate. Those are physical needs, relational needs, identity needs, spiritual needs, and instrumental needs. When we talk about physical needs, we need to consider that at the core, humans are social creatures. When we engage in communication, that's ultimately feeding our desire to interact with others. And it's proven by multiple studies and researchers that social interaction can actually better our physical health. Or if we're not engaging in enough social interaction, that can actually be physically damaging to us. Also, positive relationships strengthen mental health. I think that's one that we can all agree on, that we've seen in action in real life. And one part of this as well is stigma, which is the feeling of being an outsider, can actually affect our mental health. When we feel like we're not part of a group or part of a communication group or network, we can actually start to struggle mentally with that reality that we have fixed onto. Communication also meets our relational needs. We as humans have the need for companionship, relaxation, and escape, all of which are ultimately blossomed through communication, blossomed by communication. Not everyone's relationship needs are going to be the same. Some people may not need as much human interaction as another person, but ultimately we all have some kind of relational need. And a rich social life is also said to be a predictor of overall happiness. People that have fulfilling social lives are generally found to be happier people. Identity needs. The way we communicate with others helps shape our identity. And there's a couple of facets to this. When we interact with other people, we may end up comparing ourselves to them. So are they outgoing? Are we as outgoing as them? If not, then maybe we think of ourselves as shy. So that's a way that we may form our identity through communication. Or if people treat you a certain way, that may also shape your identity. If you're interacting with people and they refer to you as shy, or they treat you as if they're shy, or if they talk over you all the time, then you may start to identify with this shyness because of that communication interaction. Communication also feeds spiritual needs. We find that identity is very often heavily tied into one's spirituality. And communication offers the opportunity to identify with other people who may share those similar spiritual beliefs. So we're able to communicate about spirituality with others. And then communication also offers people the chance to determine their own spirituality. Maybe they're not entirely sure of where they stand on that spiritual spectrum. And as they communicate with people, they're able to figure out a little bit better, what do I believe in? What do I find the most appealing, etc. And then there's instrumental needs. We communicate our practical everyday needs. And these needs are usually pretty simple. It's things like ordering a meal at a restaurant, or having a business meeting with a client or supervisor and talking about sales, etc., what have you. So these are going to be fueling those instrumental needs, and obviously it's something that we need to do on a regular basis. So when we consider the nature of communication, scholars have put together a few examples or models of the way that the process of communication works. There's 3 in particular. There's the action model, the interaction model, and the transaction model. The action model treats communication as a one-way process. So it's pretty simplistic. We look at the source, so you as the speaker would be the source, and you formulate an idea. Then you encode that idea. You shape it into a little package that you believe is going to suffice in order to communicate that idea. And then you shape it into a message. So how precisely it is that you communicate it, how it comes out, how it sounds, how it looks when it's communicated. Then that message is sent through a communication channel. So there's multiple channels. A channel could be simply one-on-one communication, face-to-face. It could be online. So that's another channel. It could be television, radio. So there's obviously many different channels in which we can communicate, including nonverbal channels. A receiver decodes the message. So once that message is received by another individual, they are the receiver, they decode the message. They try to interpret what the message means, but there is the chance that that interpretation is affected by noise. There's multiple types of noise. Noise can be physical noise, something loud in the room that distracts you from hearing what's said, and so then you're not entirely sure what was said. But noise can also be psychological. So maybe you're angry with that person and you don't necessarily hear everything that's said because you're too distracted by that, that frustration and whatnot. It could be you're hungry and you're distracted by thinking about what you're going to have for lunch. So there's a lot of different types of noise, but at the core, noise is just something that affects how well we receive a message. Another model is called the interaction model. And this is just kind of the next step to the action model. It still considers noise, source, receiver, all that jazz. But instead of treating it as a one-way process, it treats it as a two-way process. So it also suggests that receivers provide feedback. So once they receive the message and they decode it, then they're going to provide feedback through either verbal or nonverbal behavior. So they then decode the message, figure out what was said, and then figure out how they're going to respond. Maybe they smile, or maybe they nod their head or say, yeah, absolutely. Some kind of feedback has been provided. And then in this model, the context of the communication taking place can also affect its meaning. So where is this interaction taking place? Under what circumstances is it taking place? These types of things can also influence the message and how it's encoded and decoded. Finally, there's the transaction model. This model goes even a step further. Rather than thinking of it as just a linear process, it considers it to be a multi-way process. It includes everything that was part of the interaction model, the last one, but it also suggests that both parties that are taking place in the conversation are actually simultaneously senders and receivers. So there's not just one message that's being lobbed back and forth like a tennis ball. The idea is that there are multiple balls in the air at the same time, and that both people involved in the communication process are responsible for sending and receiving at the same time. And on the same plane, communication flows in both directions at once. And a big part of this is the fact that nonverbal communication is part of communication as well. So any kind of facial gesture or recognition of a message is going to be some type of communication. And so there's going to be multiple messages, multiple communication flows going simultaneously. Some characteristics of communication. We know that we rely on multiple channels. I had suggested that earlier. Channels can be rich or lean. If a channel is rich, it means that we have a lot of different cues that we can use in order to interpret a message. So we might see someone's face, we might hear how they say something, and we can also interpret the message along with that. So face-to-face communication would be considered a rich channel because we get lots of verbal and nonverbal cues to interpret the message. A lean channel would be something more along the lines of a DM on Instagram, where you don't have someone's face to look at and all you have are the actual words that you're reading off of a screen. So with that, you're left to kind of make your own interpretations. And so there's a chance that the message will be interpreted in a fashion other than what was intended. Communication also passes through perceptual filters. So with this, what one person says is not always what the other person hears. You may deliver a message, but it doesn't mean that that's what the person is going to hear for various reasons. It's filtered. They don't necessarily pay attention to certain parts of the message, and they may focus in on another part instead. Communication is given its meaning by people. We provide a subjective interpretation of language. And when we look at the root of all of this, we need to realize that a word, the core element of communication, is just a symbol without meaning, having meaning attached to that. So we may look at a word like home, and it's a symbol for a house or for a dwelling in which we reside with a family. But without that subjective meaning that we give to it, it means absolutely nothing. Communication has literal meanings and relational implications. So within communication, there is a content dimension, which is the literal interpretation of a message, taking the words and just looking at what they mean on more of a dictionary level. And then communication also has a relational dimension. This is going to be our interpretation of the message, and the context of the situation will also play into things. So this is where we have more of this personal interpretation of a message versus the literal dictionary definition of a message. Communication ultimately sends messages. We send messages as communicators, whether it's intentional or unintentional. A lot of times we say things and people misinterpret it, so we're sending a message, we don't mean it. Nonverbal cues are often unintentional, or maybe the tone of voice sends off a message, so we don't always mean what is heard. Communication is also governed by rules. Some rules can be explicit in the sense that we specifically articulate them. We might tell people that they need to take their shoes off at the door. I guess that would be more of a non-communication rule. Let's say we tell people that they should say please and thank you. That's something that we teach children as they grow up. There are other implicit rules that society just follows. So oftentimes, if someone looks at us as we're walking down the street, we may, if they look at us and smile, let's say, we would then exchange the pleasantry and smile back. One of those implicit rules that we generally just follow without being told that that actually is a rule. There's a few myths about communication as well. One myth is that everybody is an expert, which is not true at all. There's always the opportunity to be a better communicator. Another myth is that communication will solve any problem. This is not true. There are some problems that just can't be solved, especially if we push at it and insist on communicating about it. Another myth is that communication can break down. Communication is not a machine. It doesn't just stop working. It is more like we as people become ineffective communicators. So we shouldn't look at communication as the fault. Another myth is that communication is inherently good. It's not always a good thing. You don't want to hear someone screaming at you or belittling you. So that's definitely something that wouldn't be considered a positive thing. Another myth is that more communication is always better. I think this is pretty easy for people to understand. Sometimes you just need to stop talking about something. Continuing talking about it is not going to improve a situation. It may actually even make it worse. Interpersonal communication, which can be abbreviated with the acronym IPC, occurs between two people within the context of their relationship, and as it evolves, it helps them negotiate and define their relationship. So that's kind of the core element of interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication, if you look at it, is when there's some type of communication that occurs between two people, and it's influenced by the context of their relationship, as in, who are they to one another, and what is their history, etc. And then also, as it says, that process is going to help establish, maintain, define their relationship. There's a few other types of communication. Intrapersonal communication is when you talk to yourself. So it could be an internal monologue or an external monologue. Mass communication is that which is transmitted to large groups. So when we're talking about television, radio broadcasts, etc. And then small group communication is anything that may take place between groups of 3 people or more, and generally less than 20. Anything more than that, then we'd be looking at mass personal. Interpersonal communication is pervasive. It happens everywhere on a very, very regular basis. Interpersonal communication can help improve our relationships. We use communication to define what we want from a relationship, determine what someone else wants from a relationship, etc. And then interpersonal communication can improve our health. As I mentioned earlier, it has the potential to positively impact our physical and mental health. In order to build your communication competence, you want to consider that competent communicators are effective and appropriate. Effectiveness describes how well your communication achieves its goals, how well you actually meet those goals that you have set forth. And then appropriateness describes how well your communication complies with the rules and expectations of the social situation. So looking at the context, considering those explicit and implicit rules that may determine how you should conduct yourself. Some characteristics of competent communicators, there's self-awareness. Oftentimes, in order to be aware of yourself in a communication context, is using self-monitoring. People that are self-monitors are generally very aware of their behavior and how their behavior affects others. Competent communicators are also adaptable. They're adaptable to different situations and people, so they're able to look at the situation and determine how should I effectively communicate, and then actually be able to do that. Competent communicators also utilize empathy, which is understanding people's thoughts and feelings. There's also the element of cognitive complexity. So competent communicators can consider a variety of explanations of what someone has said or done, and then understand the situation in multiple ways. Ask questions about why things were said and realize that there may be multiple meanings and interpret those. And then competent communicators are ethical. They're able to gauge the right and wrong and then make the choice to be ethical in a communication situation. In order to build your communication competence when you're online, it's a little bit different than when you're in person with someone. Competent online communicators generally are very aware of the potential for misunderstanding because it is a lean channel and we don't have those nonverbal cues to use in order to interpret a message. Competent online communicators also presume that everything is permanent and nothing is secret. So anything that you put out there is permanent. People can take screenshots and retweet, etc. So understanding that anything that you say online is then permanent and there are no secrets. And online communicators also try to avoid communicating in anger because it's permanent, because there can be misunderstanding, because it is so much easier to react or overreact when there's a screen between us and the person that's reading the message. All right, so it's all black. You guys probably can't see me. Almost, that's the end of chapter 1. So I hope that helps a little bit. You'll want to make sure and read through your textbook because there's a lot more information that you can get. This just gives you kind of an overview of some of the major concepts that appear within this chapter. There's also a few exercises that you guys can do within the chapter. You're more than welcome to do that. That's not, of course, obligatory. And if you have any questions for me, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you again soon. Have a great day.